as long as this slump can seem to go on, it seems eternal, but just when it seems like it never will end, that's when it starts to end, and there's actual science about why that would be the case. Be patient. Time will help you.
Subscribers to The Big Middle will have heard just about every guest mention the U-curve of happiness. Along the life course, social and brain science shows the curve is happy, miserable, happy. Not, as you might have surmised, happy, miserable, more miserable, until the end. Perplexed when he had his own midlife slump, my guest went into deep research mode and wrote a book about it. American Jonathan Rauch is a print journalist of distinction, the best broadsheets, the best news magazines. The book, his sixth, is the hot seller, The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. I've reached him at his home in North Virginia. Hey, Jonathan, how's your day so far? Happy?
It's very happy. I'm happy to be with you.
Now, a U-shaped happiness curve, who knew until they read your book? It flips the social script as we learn it through our lives. How's this work?
It turns out that most of what people think they know about age and happiness is wrong, and what we don't know makes us miserable. People imagine that the middle of life is the time of ultimate emotional and physical mastery, and if we're not at our peak at that stage, why then it's some kind of crisis. The opposite is true. In humans and in chimps and orangutans, the middle part of life is when it's hardest to be satisfied, and people aren't prepared for that. It takes them by surprise.
Indeed. I mean, your own story of your midlife gloom, it drove you to search for answers, and, by all conventional measures, life was sweet. You were at the top of your game. You had no health, money, or love worries, but you weren't satisfied and you couldn't figure out why.
That's just it, Susan. It's not just the slump, which is common, by the way, not universal. Lots of things affect how happy or unhappy you are. Age is only one of them, but it's significant. And a lot of people, as they enter their 30s and then on through their 40s, go through this period of dissatisfaction and disappointment. But here's the thing. In my case, it made no sense. I had achieved more than I expected in life. I'd managed to come out as gay and establish myself in a wonderful relationship and was getting traction with the issues I was working on and was writing for magazines and was healthy and had money. I mean, you name it.
Well, and you were writing so successfully. You won the equivalent of the Pulitzer for magazines.
Well, that's right. And that's when I knew that something was really wrong. When I was 45 years old, I won the magazine equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. I never expected that to happen to me, and it did. And that finally gave me that sense of fulfillment that I had craved for about 10 days. And then these voices just came back that bothered me, especially in the morning, saying I was wasting my life. I was trapped. My time was almost up. I had to run away and leave this life and start fresh. I knew it was irrational at that point, and that's when I started looking for answers to try to understand what was going on. It was not depression. I was, perfectly functional. My mood was good most of the day, like anyone else's. It was a contentment disorder, and it turns out it was completely normal, but I didn't know that.
I love the many colorful ways that you describe this. You called it a self-eating spiral of discontent. Did you drive your happier, younger and older, the people on the happy side of the miserable slump, crazy with all your moans about your seemingly outwardly perfect life?
Oh, the opposite. Part of what happens here, we can talk in a bit about what may be behind this period of adjustment. It's really a midlife adjustment or midlife transition, not a midlife crisis. But part of what can make it much worse is shame and isolation. I was ashamed of how I felt because I had no reason to feel that way. I felt I'd become a complainer and a whiner. And because I was ashamed, I didn't tell anyone about it. It was like my second time of life in the closet. The first was before I was able to tell anyone that I was gay. And the second was in midlife when I was unable to tell anyone that I had these unaccountable feelings of disappointment. And so I kept it all in. And of course,
so you did what you do as a journalist. You hit the books and you hit the phone and you did some research.
Yeah, that came later, but at the time, I wasn't even telling my husband I felt this way because, you don't want to set off alarms. I was the main breadwinner for my family. So, I just slogged through, but keeping it in, having no resources makes it much worse.
Let's put some flesh on the bones of what you've told us so far about the U-shaped happiness curve. Happy, miserable, happy. How does it flow?
Well, it's an interesting scientific detective story. The U-shaped happiness curve was discovered completely by accident by, get ready, economists, not psychologists. So these people had, in the 90s, they discovered they had these enormous data sets of happiness, life satisfaction, not mood, not am I cheerful today, but do I feel good about my life as a whole? Much better measure, actually, of how we feel about ourselves. Of countries all over the world, 149 countries, millions and millions of people. So they started to look at what affects happiness.
So you say across the world, so there was no rich-poor divide?
Correct. These data sets come from 149 countries representing between them 98% of the world's population. This was a big data feast. So what they did is decided to look at what affects happiness, income, education, marriage, employment, health, all the things that matter. And they looked at all those things, and then they took them out of the equation because that's what statisticians do. And there was something left. It turned out there was this remaining U-shaped curve that age by itself, other things being equal, age by itself was creating a drop in happiness between about the age of 25 and between the age of about 45 on the order of losing your job, maybe halfway to losing your job, or even more than that. And there it was just in the data. No one knew why it was in the data. Why would just the aging process, other things being equal, do this?
So it's time specific as opposed to anything else. It's just the passage of time.
It's the passage of time, and it's not the only thing going on. So lots of people have no trouble in midlife because other things that are happening to them are more important. But in my case, you can see where this is going. All the other things in my life were going smoothly, so I was really affected. I really felt this U-shaped dip. And that's why, in particular, the happiness curve in developed countries is a special disease. It's a particular affliction of high achievers for whom other things are going well. They really feel the effects of time. And of course, because they're high achievers, they won't know why they're feeling this way, and that will make them feel even worse, and that can drive a downward spiral.
So they don't have enough to really complain about. In the developed world, an absence of difficulty can lead to this.
So there were a couple of big surprises doing this research, and one of the big surprises is that midlife slump is very often literally about nothing. We assume it's about something. I did. I thought my job I must be in the wrong job, even though I knew it was a great job. But we flail for explanations. But what's in fact happening is we're going through a natural transition. Our values are changing. Our brains are changing. But we don't know what to attribute it to. So we lash out and we pick the wrong thing. Sometimes we leave our marriage, we leave a good job, we act impulsively, and that can lead to midlife crisis. Now, most people don't. Most people do what I do. They slog in and ahead in kind of miserable silence. But that can be alleviated if we learn to deal with this better.
You surprised me when you mentioned a couple of sentences ago that 25 was the start of the downward flow. You said 25 to 45.
Actually, the downward flow starts in early adulthood around age 20. I just mentioned 25 because the particular studies that we're measuring the extent of the downturn happened to use 25 as the starting point. But this tendency really begins in early adulthood and gradual decline, gradual but steady. At first, in your 20s, you don't really notice. And then in your 30s, you don't mind because you figure, well, this is temporary, it'll pick up. But then after it goes on year after year, and you're continually disappointed with how you're feeling about your life, by mid-40s, you're feeling disappointed in your happiness level in the present, and you're feeling pessimistic about the future, and those things feed on each other. And that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I guess in, 25 to 35, heading into your mid-40s, you're so busy. You're learning. You might take a postgraduate course. You might still be learning, and then you have to focus on earning. So you've got so much else on your plate. You may have made a couple of kids.
Yes, exactly right. And of course, by our mid-40s, we're very busy, and we're supporting sometimes our kids and our parents, and we've got jobs and civic obligations, and we're expected to be strong people and vulnerable people, masters of the universe, and that becomes another source of problem. We figure, well, if I can't, I have to be strong now. But in fact, midlife is, again, not just in humans. Next thing that happened is these guys went out and started looking at other primates, and the same pattern turned up in chimps and orangutans. But people think this is supposed to be an invulnerable time of life. In fact, it's a highly vulnerable time of life. It's a time we need more support, not less support.
I'm with you on that. The thing is, the malaise in the middle years, you've said, seems hardwired. This is what your research found into us. Is there any hard science to support that?
It's partly hardwired. We know that because it turns up in other primates. And we know that because it turns up in countries and cultures all over the world, rich and poor. It also, by the way, turns up in men and women exactly the same way. The stereotype of midlife crisis is heavily gendered toward males, the guy with the inappropriately young girlfriend and the sports car. But in fact, the U-curve phenomenon is identical across the genders. That's another surprise.
I'm really surprised by that, because when I heard about that, I thought surely not for many women. The average age for menopause is 52. And that's when you get so much hormonal turbulence that everything is thrown out of whack and the symptoms can go well into your 60s.
So remember, we're talking about satisfaction with life overall, not with, for example, mood. Possibly for that reason, although no one really knows because menopause hasn't specifically been studied, menopause does not show up in any of these data. There's no difference
between
men and women.
Incredible.
I did surveys, and I also talked to a lot of people. I also found no difference between men and women. They were describing the same kinds of experiences and the same kinds of feelings at the same times of life.
Maybe that is because menopause and openly talking about it has for so many years been taboo. Because for a lot of women, myself included, it spins you right around. The loss of motivation, loss of confidence, loss of libido, sleep. And it's not just, hot flashes and mood swings and being bitchy and twitchy. It really is a disorienting, bewildering time of life. And all my friends and I talk about this. So I just must say, maybe the research hasn't caught up with the reality of women openly discussing this, and career women who are, falling into that cohort that you spoke of, high achievers.
Well, the real answer to this is it needs to be studied. It's a peculiar thing, one would think, that menopause would show up in the data, but there's absolutely huge data now. Millions and millions of people all over the world, both genders, over a period of 40 plus years. And gender differences do not show up. And one view about that may be that, now, of course, I'm not a woman, but one view of this may be that menopause has many effects on people, but it's not how they judge their overall life. It's not how they judge their fulfillment in life. And it's something they expect, and it's very physical. So they kind of know what's going on with that, and they separate that out from questions like, am I doing something meaningful with my life? Am I having the best life and making the best decisions that I can make? So maybe that's why it doesn't show up.
So we'll just set that aside, because so much can happen. And, you've shared your personal feelings about what happened in your life. And for me, none of this fits, because I lost the love of my life in my 40s. And then, kind of once I was getting over a very long grieving period, I don't know if you ever get over it, then the menopause hit. So my life has been turbulent for a couple of decades. But in general, you have to move beyond those factors, those extenuating circumstances, and just look at the arrow of time.
Well, the main people who need to worry about this are people who find themselves in the kind of situation I was, where they've got this dissatisfaction and it's pestering them and it won't go away and it's unaccountable and strange. And then they think there's something wrong with them. And it's very important to know that this is a perfectly natural transition. What seems to be happening, we're much firmer on the what than the why, but what seems to be happening is a transition period from the values of early adulthood, which are focused on ambition and social competition, getting ahead of other people and building your social capital and checking all those boxes in life, to the values of the later decades in life, which are much more about nurturing and connecting and community, and by the way, are much better values for making human beings actually happy in life. But in between, there's this transition period. And that's a rough transition because the new values haven't kicked in yet, and the old values aren't paying off because the nature of ambition is the more you get, the more you want. So there you are, you're disappointed. Ambition has let you down for 20 years and you don't realize that this change is coming. And so that can be a long, slow grind, but it is completely normal. It is natural and healthy. And in fact, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow because the last several decades of life, contrary to popular belief, are the most happy and satisfying and fulfilling.
And the negative feedback loops, we beat ourselves up with all of the negativity that loops and loops around in our brains in midlife. They are reversed in your 50s. I mean, literally, we break out in warm, fuzzy positivity all around.
Well, I don't know about warm and fuzzy, but taking metaphorically, yeah, that's pretty much right.
Let's go through what happens. I love the fact that emotional regulation, you write, improves.
As we age, the brain changes. You can see this in fMRI scanners, actually how the brain lights up. So that's another reason we know this is partly biological. We become more sensitive to the positive and less sensitive to the negative as we get older. Now, that's completely contrary to stereotype, which is that older people are curmudgeonly. In fact, they'll react more to positive emotions and less to negative emotions. Emotional regulation gets better. So people become less volatile. They're better at managing multiple complicated emotions. They experience less regret in a given situation. They experience less stress in a given situation. And again, all of this is in brain scans, not just how people report stuff. So the brain is actually changing in a way that helps us feel more settled and more satisfied and more positive. We start looking more on the bright side. And as we do that, we're also refocusing our priorities as we get older and time gets shorter on the things that matter most, which tend to be the pursuits and especially people that we most care about. And it also turns out that focusing on those core relationships is also very good for us. So as we age, it becomes easier to feel satisfied. So to go back to the point you made, this cycle actually reverses itself in midlife. We're in this downward spiral because we're disappointed and we don't understand why. Later in life, we're in an upward spiral because we're happier than we expected to be. We don't understand that either.
No, there's no discernible reason why, because you look at the road ahead and it's shorter than the road behind. And the stereotypical view is that, as you said, you're crotchety, you're curmudgeonly, and old people equals grumpy people. And that's not what happens.
And the stereotype, Susan, makes it much worse in midlife, by the way, because we're trained to think, 50 is the top of life, and then after that, it's going to be decline and poor health and sadness and death. So we think if I haven't achieved my, life's happiness and satisfaction at 50, then the best is behind me. It's only going to get worse. The opposite is true. If people understood that 50 is the gateway to 2, 3, eventually, 4 decades of healthy and emotionally satisfying life, they wouldn't feel that sudden pressure to be on top of the world. They would feel much better about aging.
Well, I think I'm on a 10-year lag, but looking forward to that when it happens. But you're saying, when positivity happens, in this period, on the other side of the miserable slump, stress declines as well. You not only are you more in control of your emotions, you have fewer regrets, and you, as you say, the brighter side of life starts to unfold for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the opposite of what people think. Now, of course, individual mileage will individual mileage will vary. So no guarantee in individual cases, but the positivity effect, as it's called, is so strong in later years that it's even seen among cancer patients who you would expect to be absolutely miserable will often say, you know what I'm going through is really hard, but in some ways this is still a wonderful time in my life because they're connecting with people and really focusing on the things they care most about.
It's a shame that this isn't more widespread, this knowledge, because in the 50s is when ageism bites. It's rife, and it's a primary focus of this podcast. And just as we're feeling more in control, we're less emotionally trigger happy, and we've got a better perspective and experience, and let's hope we've accumulated some wisdom that we can apply. Ageism shuts us out. Even though we get an additional 10 years of life, ageism still ends up marginalizing so many people in their 50s. I mean, how can we fix that?
Well, you can do a podcast and help fix it, and that's why I'm so happy and grateful that you're having this program. Little by little, it's going to take a couple decades to knock down these awful stereotypes we have about aging. Older people can't handle technology, and they're not adaptive, and they're depressed, and they're unhealthy, so they won't show up at work regularly, and they're not productive. On and on and on. Ageism is, some experts say, the single most predominant form of discrimination in the world. The statistics on it are kind of really horrific, and I'm 58, so I know people, I should say, who are experiencing. They go out on the job market and they're passed over because they're old. So it's very important to change that stereotype, partly, of course, for the sake of older adults who are living longer and healthier and have so much to contribute. It's so much to give. It's the greatest and the only expanding natural resource, actually.
Absolutely.
Older people.
Yeah, it's a huge untapped resource, potential that remains hidden away, shoved aside. And it's just such a crying shame that society and culture and governments and public policy can't work in lockstep with the longevity gains that we're experiencing, because structurally society is it's broke.
That's exactly right. And my little contribution to this, I just finished writing the afterword for the paperback edition of Happiness Curve, which is coming out in spring of 2019. So I'm thinking a lot about ageism because that's what the afterword is about. And my little contribution to this is to point out that ageism negatively affects older adults, of course, but it also negatively affects younger adults, because in midlife, it leads to these false expectations that the future is going to be gloomy, and it leads to this false pessimism, and that leads to midlife misery, and it leads to people making bad decisions. So the happiness curve arcs all the way through life, and when we get it wrong in the later years, that ramifies all the way backwards. I saw a study, you may have seen this, Susan. It found that negative stereotypes of aging begin as early as 4th grade.
Yes. Well, we even had it earlier. My first interview on the podcast was Lord Geoffrey Filkin, the chairman of the foundation here, the Centre for Aging Better. And the research was saying just that. Kids as young as 6 have ageist attitudes. They don't want to get old. And millennials especially are disproportionately anxious about getting old.
How would the world be different if people understood from a very early age that the emotional peak of life on average is not until the 60s and 70s, and it's going to move even later in life as people live longer and get healthier? If they understood that if they're not feeling emotionally great in their 40s, they've got 20 or 30 years of improvement, steady improvement in many cases ahead of them, think how much better they would feel about the arc of their lives.
I mean, that's the dream, isn't it? To get that all sorted. In your book, you steer your readers to the work of 19th century American artist Thomas Cole, before his time in his depictions of the course of life. Can you tell us about his work, The Voyage of Life?
Thomas Cole, boy, he had a big influence on my life, because when I was 20 years old, my first visit to the National Gallery in Washington, I walked into this room and there were these four very large, absolutely magnificent paintings, and I was just gobsmacked. And they told the story of age and happiness. And it turns out that Thomas Cole in the 1840s got it right. So Cole was the founder of the naturalistic American landscape school, but he wasn't satisfied just painting landscapes. He wanted to do great allegories about life. And in 1840, when he was in his late 30s, he painted four paintings called The Voyage of Life. They picture childhood, youth, middle age, what he calls manhood, and old age. And it turns out they're a very accurate portrayal of the happiness curve. He shows youth, the young man, 20, the age I was when I saw them, reaching toward a castle in the sky. But I'm sorry, I should say that the young man is on a boat in a river, and the river represents the journey through life. And the front of the boat has an hourglass, which represents, of course, the passage of time, which is the subject of the painting. And this painting it's depicting the ambition, not just to achieve things, but the expectation of future happiness. But then the next painting, manhood, middle age, very different scene. The river has veered and the middle-aged man now is on rapids, headed toward what looks like a cataract. The sky is gloomy and stormy, and he's praying because his tiller has broken off. He no longer even feels he's in control. But we can see what he cannot through a gap in the rocks. We're a little bit higher. And we can see through the rocks that what actually is ahead of him, though he doesn't know it, is smooth sailing. And then that's the last painting, old age. He's an old man in the boat. At this point, he's getting ready to pass on to the next world, but he's in these placid waters. Well, this turns out to be surprisingly scientifically accurate. It's a wonderful set of paintings, and if you or any of your listeners get to Washington, D.C., to the National Gallery, you will love them.
Just wonderful. So before the raft of studies that you had to research, at 20, you had seen this, and it must have made quite an impression.
Well, it did, because there I was at 20. I was exactly described by the youth painting. The youth is the same age as I was, and I was reaching for that castle in the sky, grand ambitions, not just to do things, but for fulfillment that I knew that doing things would bring. And something else I thought I knew when I was 20 is if I even ever got a single article published in a national magazine like The Atlantic, then I would feel fulfilled for the rest of my life. Mission accomplished. And so I knew the midlife painting would never apply to me. Of course, when I got to my 40s, I was exactly in the midlife painting. I had so much to be thankful for, yet my emotional life was unsteady and disappointed and kind of dark, and I didn't understand why, nor did I know that the river was going to change and turn positive again.
Well, that's the thing. You think the spiral will never end. You just slump deeper, and you do, unless you know. And let's face it, the script as we learn it doesn't include this period where there's an opening in smooth waters after the dark period. The conditioning we all get is it's decline, it's decrepitude. Right. Look out for it.
So, and that's the part that Cole got wrong, because when Cole was painting, average life expectancy was more like 65. And there wasn't that much time after midlife. So that's why after manhood, he shows the old man getting ready to die. Cole himself did not live past his 40s. He died, I think, age 47 of disease, very common in those days. Today, we have, I would argue, the greatest single gift in the history of the entire human species, bar none, better than agriculture, better even than the iPad. We're getting 1 to 2, eventually there are going to be 3 decades of additional healthy, vigorous life in the most pro-social and satisfying part of life, late adulthood. And that's an incredible thing. And people need to know that, because that's a fantastic social resource, as we've discussed. but it's also a great personal resource. It needs to change the way we think about our lives.
Yeah, it's a social resource that, for now, it's being squandered, but I'm with you. It is the biggest gift. We are living in a social revolution, but we're all so busy. I mean, I was thinking about the days of Thomas Cole. Bodies were busy, most minds were still, and now it's the flip of that. It's busy minds and still bodies for the most part. And we have a surplus of every material comfort. Food in the main, unless in the very impoverished countries, is there for the picking and the asking and the buying. What do you say to those who might think the U-curve is grounded only in our endless selfish thinking about things that we want as opposed to what we need or how we behave or how we should behave?
I'd say one of the most interesting and important things to come out of the research that's gone on about aging and happiness is it's kind of the opposite of what you just said. It's the discovery that material things matter much less to life satisfaction than most of us think. Now, this wouldn't have surprised the ancients, and it wouldn't have surprised the people in your wonderful phrase who were, how did you put it? The minds were at
Bodies
peace.
were busy and most minds were still in days gone by.
That's a wonderful phrase. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind too much. But today, we kind of expect that if we're doing well financially, then we should be happy. Or if we're achieving lots of social status, then we should be happy. Well, it turns out that far and away, the most important thing in determining life satisfaction, deep happiness, big picture happiness, not just cheerfulness. The most important thing is trusting, loving connections to other people. We're social animals all the way through. And this is not only important, a brand new study finds that having those strong connections to your spouse and your boss and your community can ameliorate or actually counteract the downswing in the U-curve.
It's difficult, isn't it, though, because globalization and we're all sort of torn asunder. Families are here, there, and everywhere. My closest family, they're in Cape Town. And me, I'm a widow, and it's difficult in your 50s to meet, the chap on the white horse again.
Yeah, and of course, social media doesn't help. In fact, it hurts. At the beginning, people thought social media would connect us all and make us happy, but it turns out social media turns out to be a place that spawns outrage and where people, they don't communicate, they don't connect often, they display, which is a very different phenomenon.
Yes, the peacock factor. But I do have to just say, counterpoint to that, I did have a fascinating guest on a couple of weeks ago, Nadia Tuma Weldon. She wrote Truth About Age for McCann, the communications agency. And she found that people are now connecting, because I made the point that social media, it's not the wondrous thing that we all thought it might be, connecting people. It is all about peacockery, really, self-promotion. But she said, well, no, all around the world, passion points are connecting people. And she was mentioning a really good example about sneakerheads, all around the world. And they can connect and form their own communities, which is a point too, a good point.
Well, I respectfully disagree. The evidence that I've seen says that connecting with disembodied people across the world about subject matter is fun as a hobby, but it's not comparable to loving one-on-one human flesh and blood connectivity. That's connection to our community and the people in our everyday lives, our friends and our neighbors face to face. That's what does it.
Well, I can't quarrel with that at all and don't want to, but I suppose for people who have no one around them, social media can be a vehicle for a measure of connection, if not the best connection.
Maybe, maybe not. As you know, I'm pretty down on social media. The bad effects lately seem to be swamping the good. But in any case, I think the important thing is to understand that what really counts the most, what we need to focus more on, is those interpersonal, face-to-face, everyday human connections. Caring for others in our own environment, in our own world, that's critical.
You've said you're 58, you're happy now, all of that angst, that existential angst you were suffering, your midlife slump is, the bulk of it is gone. But with everything you've learned about the happiness curve, how are you feeling about your future?
One of the great things about writing this book, Susan, is understanding how much there is to look forward to. So I have a sense of optimism about the future, which is very different from, for example, my father's. My father, when he was my age, constantly complained about growing old was going to be terrible. He was terribly pessimistic and frightened about it. So the fear factor is lower. And I also look differently at older people around me. I feel less of that kind of pity that I used to just assume was the case. I feel more respectful of their abilities. I feel like I'm starting to work on my own inner ageist. And that's
Good.
also kind of rewarding. I'm going to tell a little story about that. When I was traveling for the book several months ago, I checked into a hotel one night, and the check-in clerk behind the counter was probably 75, maybe 77. I don't know. I didn't ask his age, but he was an older adult. And he was brisk and efficient and walked me to the elevator. And the first thing I felt was kind of astonishment, thinking, wow, he's doing really well for an old guy. And then, of course, the second thing I felt was, oh my gosh, look at the way I just reacted to this, as if it's surprising that a man in his 70s could do this job. Why am I surprised by that? The problem isn't him. The problem is me.
Exactly. As Ashton Applewhite likes to say, ageism happens between your ears, between all of our ears, and the social messages that barrage us from when we're 4 and 6 and 9 and throughout our lives. That's where it begins. That's where it becomes internalized. And we really just have to open our eyes up. And I know I'm the same as you. You know, you say, oh, she's really in great shape for, someone in their 70s. And then you think, well, that's how 70-year-olds look now. Aren't we lucky?
Ashton really helped sensitize me to things like this. So I no longer do that mock serious thing of being embarrassed about my age, which people do all the time. I'm perfectly proud of my age, and anyone can ask it, and I'm very happy to tell them.
Me too.
And I no longer use the phrase senior moment when I have a perfectly ordinary memory gap. All these little things that I wasn't even conscious of, I'm trying to become more aware of and work on.
Yes, I mean, Ashton's fantastic. She's really sensitized all of us to the ageism that we tend to spout all the time without even thinking about it.
Yes, ageism is embedded between our ears, not only in our attitudes, but also in this incorrect assumption about the trajectory of happiness in life that we've been talking about.
One final question for you, Jonathan. What advice would you offer to those on the cusp of the slump? They feel they're about to spiral down into it. Any tip that you could give them to maybe lessen the impact?
So my book is full of tips. I can reel them off very briefly, but I'd urge people to go and read about them in a bit more detail. Some of them include, for example, step, don't leap. You may feel the intense desire to change your life up in middle age, and change is often good and necessary at any age. We don't want ourselves to stagnate, but especially at midlife. The tendency to be impulsive is not your friend. So what I say, the way I put it is step, don't leap. If you're changing your life, make sure it's a sensible plan, vet it with other people, build on your skills and accomplishments and social networks. Don't throw them away. Be logical and stepwise. Stay in the present. Present orientedness is very helpful because midlife slump is a time trap. You're disappointed in your past and you're pessimistic about your future. So present mindedness, which can take the shape of meditation or pursuits and hobbies that absorb you, or just trying not to think so much about the future. Something else that helps is kind of what you can think of as a form of cognitive behavior therapy where you just interrupt those inner voices. Take control of your inner monologue when you start feeling, these voices, inner critics saying, you're not doing anything with your life. You're wasting your time. Or what about Susan? Why don't I have my podcast? Interrupt them. Say, I used a phrase, no comparison. I would just cut off the voices before they start. And that just helped take control of the conversation. Something else super, super important is normalize. It's very important to understand if you're experiencing a slump in midlife emotionally, there is nothing wrong with you. In fact, there is something right with you. You are in the process of transition to a new kind of satisfaction in life. And it's just something humans often go through. It's fine. So you can get rid of, to the extent you can, all the worries about, being crazy in the head. That's why it's important to read a book like mine or other books on this to understand what you're dealing with, have the right information. And then another very important thing, maybe the most important, time is on your side. As long as this slump can seem to go on, it seems eternal, but just when it seems like it never will end, that's when it starts to end. And there's actual science about why that would be the case. Be patient. Time will help you. And that's also important to know.
Jonathan Rauch, author of The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. Fascinating, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Jonathan is a senior fellow at the American think tank, the Brookings Institution, and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. An online search unearths a trove of sharp thinking and writing on public policy, culture, and government, not just happiness and midlife. One of the many I recommend is titled How American Politics Went Insane. Links to all, as ever, in the show notes of this episode. Until next time, thank you for listening.